or may have focused on one of those two tests for a while, and they got to a certain level, but they're just not happy, and they're hesitant. Should I try the other test? You talked about like nothing is lost or for naught if you've been practicing for the EA and then taking the GMAT or vice versa. What about pivoting between GMAT products and the GRE? UTS.
A good question. It's adapted in that the first half of each section informs the second half of each section. And then your score on IR, which is always the first section, integrated reasoning, actually does inform where you start on quant. And the schools in New York, so Columbia and NYU both accept it, and they've accepted it for years. Duke accepts it, and they've accepted it for their full-time program for maybe 3 years. Something.
And what the business schools want to know, they want to understand, are you going to be able to really meet the schools where they're at the levels that they expect you to be at, especially with quant?
Hey MBA hopefuls, we're live on air with MBA Waves, talking all things business and education. Please give us a like and subscribe because it helps us to continue to create all the free MBA Waves content. And today on episode 140, we're talking about how there are more than one way to get into your favorite MBA program. You're going to learn about the different tests that can get you into the business school, how to decide between them, and of course, tips and strategies to ace these tests. This week, I'm your host, Krithika, joined by my co-hosts, Bara and Eric. And we're also joined by our special guest, Travis Morgan of MBA Whisperer. And he's also one of the experts in GMAT and GRE and all things test related. So hi, everyone.
Hey, Krithika. Hey, Travis. Welcome.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi. And we're just going to jump right in. Test. Everyone's so stressed out. Travis, tell me about who should consider taking the GMAT, GRE, or EA and why?
Thanks, Krithika. And hi, guys. It's great to be with you again. And so I get this quite a bit. So I tutor for the GMAT, the GRE, and the EA. And so I'm kind of test agnostic. I'm happy to, move people from one test to another if we feel like it would be advantageous. To me, most people tend to start off with the GMAT. It's the most popular test in applying to business school, and it continues to be so. It has gone through a number of changes with GMAT Focus, as we've discussed on MBA Waves many times. But it's an intimidating test. I will tell you. I think, my opinion about GMAT Focus is that they've kind of marketed it as, it's shorter. It's more user-friendly. You can change 3 answers at the end, this sort of thing. But I will tell you that by making the test shorter, it has become a very intimidating exam. The quant has become, you can adapt up in the even harder questions that were ever on the original GMAT. And so it is, and it serves difficult questions very early in the exam. And the key is don't get intimidated by that. If you see a question like, oh my gosh, this is harder than anything I've ever seen in my whole life, just skip it and keep moving, right? So I'd say the GMAT is a great exam for people who are not easily intimidated, people who have very strong quant skills. And I always say, if you're going to score higher than the school's average, take the GMAT. So if you're a very strong standardized test taker, take the GMAT. It works out well for their rankings to have people who are well above the school's average. So, so that can be helpful to them. The GRE is one, many people say, just take the GRE. It's a quote unquote easier test. In my experience, it is not an easier test, but the quant is more straightforward. So if you're a more, what I describe as sort of, you prefer linear processes, like just give me the steps, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and I just solve it. The GRE quant is going to be more palatable to you. It's a little more straightforward. GRE verbal, on the other hand, for most people, is harder. So not only does it have the reading comp and the critical reasoning question types like we see on the GRE, there's 2 other question types called text completion, sentence equivalence, and those are very vocab heavy. I'm a terrible memorizer, really bad, and And so if you're not great at memorizing just hundreds and hundreds of words of vocab, the GRE verbal can be a challenge. Of course, there are strategies and things that you can utilize to improve the chances that you're going to get the question right, even if you don't happen to know all of the words in that question. So there are opportunities to improve your score even beyond just straight up memorization, but it is a challenge. My personal favorite exam of the three is the executive assessment. As I work with clients, the score that tends to come through that is closest to what I would assess as their true ability level, like, on the actual topics, not just their ability to take a test, is the executive assessment. Like it's the best measure of true ability level, in my opinion. However, it's not taken by all of the full-time MBA programs. If you're applying to an exec or a part-time, I strongly recommend executive assessment because many of the programs accept it. Full-time programs, it's a more limited list. However, if your school is on the list, the EA is probably the top exam that you can take for getting into that school. The number one advantage, I would say, to taking the EA for a full-time MBA program is, and we'll see with the upcoming rankings, but US News and World Report is the ranking that incorporates test scores most heavily into its ranking. And they don't use the executive assessment. And so it does not penalize the school to accept someone with a lower EA score if they think that you can cut it in the program. And so if a school accepts the EA, in my opinion, the EA is absolutely the best score, the best test to take. Yeah.
You have a sense of what kind of numbers, sorry to just jump in, what kind of numbers we're looking at in terms of schools, say in the US or in Europe, that are accepting the EA so far? I know we're still waiting for some data from some of these companies. Any idea at the moment?
Full-time programs is not very many. Yeah. In the US, in terms of, it's maybe 10, 12 schools that accept it. The ones that are in the US that are highest ranked that accept it, the schools in New York, so Columbia and NYU both accept it, and they've accepted it for years. Duke accepts it, and they've accepted it for their full-time program for maybe 3 years, something like that. And then kind of a handful of schools after that, but the very highest ranked schools do not accept it for their full-time programs. Yeah.
We should probably mention that Travis not only is a test whisperer, but he's also an admissions consultant. So really, he's a one-stop shop for understanding how these tests are looked at by a variety of schools. So that's really a great thing that you offer. I want to just say one thing about the tests for our viewers, which is that all of getting into the weeds is super important because you have to understand what the mechanics are. And I want to ask Travis a little bit more about this. But it's also understanding that these tests, their clients are really the business schools, right? The people who are their customers are the business schools. It's not you, the test taker. You're just you're kind of the user. So an understanding that the business schools have allocated what these tests are all about, and what the business schools want to know, they want to understand, are you going to be able to really meet the schools where they're at the levels that they expect you to be at, especially with quant, which is why it's important to understand where you fit. And if you look at how the tests are set up, like the GRE is a more general test that's accepted by a variety of different programs. So therefore, they're not going to have the same kind of vibe, for lack of a better word. It's really going to be a test whether you're going to chemistry, comp lit, or business school. Whereas the GMAT was established, I think, in 1953 for business schools, right? So that's going to be, that's always been just for business schools. The executive assessment, interestingly, was created for what happens when you're an executive and you're going to go back to school. Like, do you really need to know all the stuff that the youngins are going to be taking for the GMAT focus? You don't really need to know that in the same way because you've got all this business experience behind you. And all the tests are really looking at critical reasoning and how you think through problems and problem solving and assertiveness. So the executive assessment is scaled in a way that they kind of want to just know the baseline of score that you're going to get, not necessarily the best score. Whereas GMAT you want to get the best score. Would you agree with that, Travis?
Yes, and I'd say that's a function of the programs themselves versus the test. Like, I mean, you can still
score amazing.
The materials are actually remarkably similar between GMAT and the executive assessment. There's, the GMAC has done a lot of great marketing to say, oh, you don't have to study for the EA, just go in and take it, like, minimal, it's like the actual content that is being tested is nearly identical on the two, but their scores and their scales that they use are very different. And so, and they don't really publish percentiles anymore on the EA. You have to really go digging to find it. And that's done intentionally, Bara, exactly to your point, which is the programs that it was intended for, the EMBA programs and sometimes part-time MBA programs, really just want to see, can you cut it, right? Do you check off the box? Like, are you going to be able to succeed academically? And that's it, because their rankings don't incorporate test scores. Yeah.
And on top of that, because they're not comparing percentiles or publishing them, you're not being compared against other test takers from that bandwidth or that time frame, as well as it's not computer adaptive, as I understand, and it is shorter. There's a number of differences, even though it is, like you said, very much the same material.
It's just barely computer adaptive. It's adaptive in that the first half of each section informs the second half of each section. And then your score on IR, which is always the first section, integrated reasoning, actually does inform where you start on quant and verbal. Yeah, so you may get adapted more difficult. Well, for the EA, it's still called IR. So.
And the other challenge would be that you can only take it twice.
You can take it twice in person. You can take it twice online. So the two systems are separate. Which is actually a real advantage. To be able to take it 4 times instead of only 2 times.
Thanks for clarifying that. I didn't know that. I thought it was only twice.
That's when it first came out. That was the rule. It was only twice, and they still advertise that, right? Because they don't really like people taking the EA a whole bunch of times. But
I want to ask you, Travis, from where you sit, could it be a strategy? And I'm thinking 2 different ways of looking at this: to start with an EA and take that as a sort of warm up or building up kind of knowledge of the questions, how to handle them, confidence in yourself, and then take the GMAT, or could do it the other way around. Try your best at the GMAT. If it's not working out, then pivot to the EA if the schools that you're looking for accept it.
That's how I do it with most of my clients. Is I start them on the GMAT. It's a little more demanding of an exam, right? And if we're just not able to hit the scores that we're looking for, literally every minute that you spend studying for the GMAT is going to be effective for the EA. Quite frankly, vice versa is also the case, true. But then you're moving from, a little more forgiving of an exam to a little more demanding of an exam, which is, in my opinion, it would make the GMAT feel hard. That said, though, like I had a client who we worked with him on the GMAT. We actually transitioned him to the GRE. He got a decent but not amazing score on the GRE, and I said, I still think you should take the EA for the programs that accept the EA. And he had a little more work experience, kind of right on the cusp of where you would be either full-time or an executive program. And so he applied to a program at MIT Sloan called Sloan Fellows, along with Stanford MSX, and got a pretty good score on the EA. And I said, I still think you've got more in you. He got a near perfect score on integrated reasoning the second time around, and was able to get into MIT Sloan Fellows. He's starting right now. And so being willing to shift from one test to another, I think, and see where you can really maximize your score is a great strategy. And quite frankly, the tests are just not that different. And so you can shift from one to another and take the other exam within a matter of weeks sometimes.
If I may ask, in that same vein about switching tests, right? I'm thinking about the GRE now, right? And for our listeners who are either hesitating between the two or may have focused on one of those 2 tests for a while, and they've got to a certain level, but they're just not happy and they're hesitant. Should I try the other test? You talked about like nothing is lost or for naught if you've been practicing for the EA and then taking the GMAT or vice versa. What about pivoting between GMAT products and the GRE? UTS?
A good question. And it's also just not that big of a deal. Yeah. So the transition on, for example, on the quant, the topics tested are nearly identical. Yeah. So there is on the GRE, there's a little bit more emphasis on statistics. So you are going to be asked things about like normal curves and percentiles and quartiles, which is not really tested on GMAT products, GMAT GRE or GMAT EA. And as I mentioned, the questions are a little bit more straightforward on the GRE. And there is a question type called quantitative comparison, which is different, but it's not on the GMAT, but it is similar enough to data sufficiency to where if you've studied for the GMAT and you are familiar with the data sufficiency question type, you'll be able to utilize those same skills and transfer that over to the GRE pretty easily. Yeah. So most people actually wait too long, I think, to make a possible change, right? To test out another exam. And I encourage them, just take a practice exam. These exams are so much shorter now. It's a much less investment in time. And so just try it out and see if it feels more comfortable. Even if your score is about equivalent, if another test just feels more comfortable to you, that is a good sign that it's a better test for you. You're going to ramp up higher. Yeah. If your initial, if your initial impression is, ooh, this just feels better. This just feels like my test. You should switch.
Trust your gut.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's also
to take up mock tests of these because these are also readily available.
Yep. The official test will always give you the best scores, especially on the GMAT products. Yeah. So there's not great practice exams that are not official for the GMAT and the EA. Yeah. Their scores are not really all that great. Yeah. Especially given that they just changed to GMAT Focus not that long ago. And I will tell you, it's an entirely different algorithm than the GMAT was. So people talk about how, you've got to focus on the early questions. And if you get a question right, it gives you a harder question. If you get a question wrong, it gives you an easier question. A very linear algorithm that is based on what's called item response theory. If we want to get really wonky and very nerdy here, basically your response to one item directly impacted what the next item was that it gave you in the exam. The new GMAT Focus is a totally different algorithm. Yeah, like they just threw out the old algorithm. It's a whole new algorithm. Everything that you read online is wrong now. About this, it is much more what I describe as like a round robin tournament. Okay, so you are kind of randomly matched up with an opponent with a question, and if you're getting those questions right, kind of the cloud will adapt, higher and higher and higher, but you will still have opponents that are not necessarily the very hardest questions, right? And so the key is you've got to get those easy questions right. I do not believe that any practice exams that are not the official exams have this new algorithm built into them. So they're not very accurate. Yeah.
I don't know if I told you this, Travis, but when the GMAT people came to San Francisco, and unfortunately you weren't there, you have to come to the next one. I posed that question to them about the item response theory, because for years they always said, no, that's not how it works. Like how you score on one question is not going to determine how you score on these other things. And finally, they after it's no longer a test that they're giving, they're like, yeah, that's kind of how it works. So
yes.
I think the round robin way of describing it is actually really apt, because it is to a certain extent a mystery, but it feels like they're kind of edging around the difficulty to kind of, I don't know, it's like SPY 2.0 or something. It's like a different way of scoring.
It is. Yeah. And so you really have to just take each question, one question at a time. You cannot sort of see like, oh my gosh, I got this super easy question. I must be doing poorly. That is not how it works anymore. Right. So nor I got this ridiculously hard question. I must be doing great. It actually doesn't work that way either. And so if you've ever played in a round robin, like any sort of sporting event in a round robin tournament, you could hit the very best player in the tournament very early, and they just absolutely crush you. And that's what it feels like on the new GMAT, and you just cannot get intimidated by that. You've got to just skip it and move on. Yeah.
But that's so important. I'm sorry to talk. That's so important as far as getting the mindset of the student to understand that they can't game it, right? Because I think that students used to game it and just be like exactly the way that you said, like, oh, this is hard, that must mean this. Oh, that's easy, that must mean this. And then they wind up being in these parallel mental paths instead of addressing each question one by one as they went through it. And so it's really a thing. That's a good business person skill anyway, right?
Adaptability.
Adaptability is super important, and staying cool under pressure, which you couldn't do it in the same way because people were always gaming it. So it's an interesting shift for necessary for the student.
I mean, I absolutely agree. But I think what I heard at the AIGAC conference was that's one of the key skills that most business schools are looking for, is that adaptability, right? We're in a world constantly changing with a lot of unpredictable things, and to be able to adapt and to adjust and to shift direction if necessary is absolutely key in leadership.
It's a good point, Eric. And actually, sorry, Krithika. Yeah, a lot of folks get frustrated because the GMAT feels tricky, right? And they're like, why are they trying to trick me? Why don't they just ask me these questions? Which is more the GRE style. And it's not just testing your math ability and your English ability. That's not what it's testing, right? It's also testing your ability to perform under pressure, your ability to make snap decisions and be able to set priorities, right? Like, is my priority to get this question right no matter what, even if it takes me 5 minutes, even if it takes me 8 minutes? The answer is no. That is not your priority, right? And so are you able to make those decisions in real time? Is being tested. They just don't tell you it's being tested. They kind of tell you it's a math test and an English test, and it's not. It's actually testing these higher order problem solving skills, which is what business schools want. Note, like Bara said, it's business school deans that sit on the board of GMAC. It's not. It's sort of more a broad group for the GRE. So the GMAT tests these skills that business schools want directly. Yeah. Sorry, Krithika, what you were going to say something.
That's so nice to hear, and I just had to squeeze this question in. I wanted to know is, earlier people had this mindset that I'm going to give the GMAT once, or I'll take the GRE once. I need to get like the first score and so on. Do you think that with the GMAT focus, there should be a shift in how students are viewing and how many attempts they should have at a test?
It's a great question. And I think that there's a real misnomer here that you should only take a test one time. And in fact, that if you took it one time and just shot it out of the park in that first shot, that is viewed better by the schools than if you took it multiple times. And that is just not the case. It just isn't. Like, and in fact, in not this conference, but last year's conference, an admissions officer mentioned how she was reviewing an applicant, and for their demographic and for their kind of overrepresented industry, I'm guessing that it was management consulting, but I don't know, that they were just okay, just sort of so-so, and they were kind of looking at it like, oh, it's kind of lazy, this person only to have taken it once and their score is just okay. And then they actually saw later on in the application that they had taken it 3 times and that they had increased all 3 times. It actually made them more like the candidate because they realized that they had worked hard, they had improved their score, they had gotten it up to this point, that they were not lazy, and that they actually ended up admitting this person. Isn't that interesting? So, showcasing that you work hard to achieve your goals and that you can increase your score is not a negative thing. So you don't necessarily have to cancel these scores. Like, as long as your scores are improving, that's a positive. And I will tell you, some schools will give the advice to take it up to 3 times. And I've even pressed them on that. I've asked them, why do you give that advice? And they said, oh, we've just found that people tend to plateau out after that. I'm like, it depends on your prep. Yeah, if you're doing the same prep, you're not changing the way that you're approaching the exam. Yeah, you will plateau out. But if you adjust the way that you're approaching the exam, you will continue to improve. And so, yeah, you can take the exam up to 5 times in a 12-month period, up to 8 times in a lifetime. And even the dirty little secret there is actually GMAT is very flexible on that 8 times in a lifetime cap. So yeah, you can actually take it more times than that if you're a legitimate test taker and not just trying to see as many official questions as possible as
people like Travis and
as a tutor.
love taking tests. Have you ever met anyone who's taken the test 8 times? I certainly have not. But to your point,
I have a client who took it 8 times and got a waiver to take it an additional 9th time. Yeah, and it was very easy. They just basically called him up, or I can't remember if they called or emailed and said, "Hey, am I able to take it another time?" And said, "Yeah, sure." So,
I mean, I always advise that. It is a mark of your character that you're willing to work hard to achieve a goal, that you're resilient, that you're, growth mindset that we always talk about. Absolutely. So there's nothing wrong with that. I do think that you tend to plateau after 3 or 4 times, but if you do significantly change your strategy, you will improve, as you said. I think it just a little change. I think you have to make a big investment in how you're preparing.
I think that's super important and I think that this is a plug for understanding how you best prepare. Because if you go to a big box company that's just a one size fits all, you might plateau pretty quickly. But if you go to a more specialized, individualized tutor, then the tutor's going to respond to your needs. You're not going to, if you have a good tutor, they're going to understand how you think through things and what you need to change, what patterns you have, what you need to improve. And they're not teaching at you and just in a very sort of objectified way. They're teaching with you and moving you through the way that you need to move through. So when you prepare, like you might think, oh, you've already paid for a program and why should you pay for the fine tuning? You might want to start off with fine tuning because then you only have to do it once. Because if you get good tutors and a good program that's really robust and comprehensive, you don't need to find all these different ways yourself. So do think about how you.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah, really good point. I actually had a client a couple of years ago. I put his quote on my website. Actually, he had worked with 7 or 8 tutors before he got to me, and was still just plateaued out. And he, after our very first session, he goes, "Wow, Travis, this is really different." Yeah, and it's like, yeah, if you just are approaching a client and you're saying, "Hey, how are you approaching the exam now? And what are these little adjustments that we can make to your process?" Not just keep teaching you more and more formulas and more content, which you probably already know, but adjusting your process, you can actually see very big gains even after taking the exam several times. So yeah, no, it's a good point. Team, did we want to address test waivers? Before we go? Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Because this is something that's becoming more and more common, with schools, and they're getting more data now. And so we're going to start to see whether or not those who receive a test waiver are performing as well academically in their programs as their peers that take a test. That data has not really come through yet from the schools. Most schools' test waivers policies came out during COVID, so they have maximum about 3 years of data so far. But for many people, a test waiver is an advantage to you. Yeah, so I would say only about 10% of the population is naturally good standardized test takers. About 90% of the population is not. Yeah, and so if you are really, really struggling on standardized tests and you're going to come in way below the school's average, a test waiver is absolutely going to be to your advantage. And so if you qualify, different schools have different processes of how they do it. Some schools, they will tell you whether you got the test waiver beforehand, which is the most logical process, but some of them you just have to submit your application without a test score, and they will tell you whether or not you qualified for a test waiver in the same process as reviewing your application, which is a little nerve-wracking. But if you qualify for it and you are scoring well below the school's average, take the test waiver. You do not want to submit a score that's well below average. It will do you well. Of course, if you have other data points that are strong, that AKA your GPA, that is going to serve you a lot better than if you also have a GPA that's well below the school's average.
Yeah.
Typically, if you have one data point below, you need the other one above. Yeah.
Right. It has to compensate. It has, it comes with the caveat that you better be confident in the other aspects of your application, not just like, okay, I don't take the test, and
Correct. Yeah.
It's not going to land well. Travis, I wanted to talk some numbers with you. So obviously with the GMAT focus compared to the new test, right? They say the 685 is the new 740, right? That's 76 percentile. What are the things you've been hearing there? This is what we really want to get into. The juice.
This is it's a tricky topic because I actually don't think the schools themselves understand this very well. Yeah, and so there may be some circumstances where in an optional essay you may actually need to coach them a little bit, which sounds a little bit pretentious. You don't want to, you just want to mention certain things. Yeah, in the sort of the part of the curve of scores that we typically care about, you basically just add 50 points, and that is, and that will. If you add 50 points to GMAT focus, that will give you the rough, average of what you're looking at. So I have a guy who just scored a 715 on the new one, which puts him at a 760, 770 range on that, which is awesome. But I also had another client who, I can't remember what the GMAT focus score was, but it basically put him in 620, 630. 720, 730 range on the previous exam, which is he had already scored a 720. He was super disappointed. Interestingly, I did a little bit of digging because I'm a nerd, and I looked at his direct percentiles of quant and verbal because I said, I know you have improved. I know you've improved, right? I've worked with you enough, and I just have a sense of like, you are stronger than a 720. I know that. And we dug into the numbers just on the quant and verbal. And if you just took those percentiles and put them on the old scaled score, it was a 750. 750. Under the same percentiles, the schools will never know that. Yeah, the schools will never know it. They just use the concordance table, the same table that you have publicly, and it's basically a comparison of the overall percentiles. GMAT focus does not, for most people, is a disadvantage on that concordance table. He had even scored a 90th percentile on DI, by the way, and but even 90th percentile on DI brought him down from an equivalent 750 to an equivalent 720, 730. So there are some, if you do some digging, if you're like, man, this just doesn't, like, I feel like this should be a better score than the table tells me that it is. It might be. Yeah, it might be. And you might want to just put one line in your optional essay that says, these percentiles on the legacy GMAT, would have been a 51 and a 42, which would have been a 750 score. Just a one line, just to, kind of give a clue to some of the schools that this concordance table is not actually serving most test takers very well. Yeah.
All of these tests are new. All of them are new, right? And so it's been like the whole test industry, if anyone has been keeping score, has been just completely shifted and changed since COVID. So COVID, we had all of the people taking tests at home, right? Because we weren't going out, we were in lockdown. And then there's been this response that the GRE has changed. We haven't even talked much about that, but because you were talking so much about how the GMAT is so completely different, the focus, than the earlier version. The current GRE is actually all the same content, but they've just shortened it. And then they've made each question actually worth so much more because there's so far, there's fewer of them. And I mean, there are some minor changes, but generally speaking, it's like the SAT changed, the ACT is in the process of changing, the LSAT is changing, GMAT. I mean, like all of these tests that have been the same for so long have really responded to a need. And then if you've been keeping score, a lot of schools, at least SATs and colleges, it was like test optional or test blind, or all of a sudden all of the top schools are now requiring again, that you need these standardized tests. So it's good that we talked about waivers, and it makes sense for some people to get a test waiver. But, you know, when you look at the different schools and what these tests do, remember, you're being compared to every other person who's taking these tests, and they need something that's not adaptable. Like, there's no grade inflation. There's no, this is so objective. The score is objective versus all of these other aspects of your application that are more subjective. So that's why they're important.
Or qualitative.
By the way, a couple of thoughts came to my mind, Bara, on that, which was number one, yes, they are changing, and honestly, I wish they would change even more. You know, yeah, these are like long overdue changes, but I would love to see an assessment for business school that there's not like right and wrong answers, but it just, you know, it's kind of like what you see on a lot of these 360 assessments, where it's like, you know, where do your strengths and weaknesses lie? And there's not like that you have to have a strength in this and a weakness in that or whatever, but, you know, or that you need strengths in all 360 degrees. It would just be a true assessment that just gives these admissions officers some information about, like, oh, this person's going to be more like this person's going to be more like that, and enables them to craft a truly holistic class. It could be done. I mean, they do have assessments like this, and they could use it for business school, but they don't. Yeah. And so instead, you just get this quant verbal and now data insights on there. In terms of the GRE, though, I have a theory. The GRE has always been a bit of a black box on how their scoring algorithm works. And with the shorter exam, and they are very adamant about the fact that they're still able to get the same that they're still able to get the same quality results with the new exam. I think it has got to weight questions differently in order to do that. Yeah, it's not just equal weighting. And so if you get a very, very, very difficult question wrong, I doubt it affects your score all that much. But if you get a very easy question wrong, just like on the GMAT, it will affect your score a ton. And so that's my theory. I don't have any proof for it, but in seeing my clients practice exams and things, it seems like this is likely the case.
I have something interesting to share. So I was at another conference, and one of the test makers, I mean, it was the College Board, talked about, which I have not heard GMAC say this at all. So I'm not saying that GMAC is doing this, but the College Board has been talking about they're actually weighting questions through AI and looking at how long it's taking you to do questions, and then determining if that's actually a guess or not. And they're including that in how they're scoring. So it's a completely different, I know, it's a completely different thing, because what I know. So what happens if they're assessing how you're taking the test because it is computerized? They're not doing eye movement, but they're doing something else to determine how the quality of your answer. So it's a whole new world, and I wouldn't be surprised if the test makers they're not doing it as far as we know, but other tests are, and so it's kind of a interesting terrain that we're entering in.
I will say that GMAC has said that the exam adapts based on 3 criteria now instead of just 1. So the 1 used to be whether you got the question right or wrong. That was it. We don't know what those 3 criteria are. They're keeping that kind of close to the vest. But it very likely might be topic based as well, so that the test is a little bit better at serving up topics more broadly. So, but yeah, we don't know exactly how it adapts. Yeah.
So which brings me to this thought, Travis. What do you think are impressions about these tests among the employers? And how are they going to view it? They're going to wait for the schools to reveal like the GMAT focus averages and again, like, all the new shorter GRE averages and so on.
Yep. My guess is among employers that they're also just going to use the same concordance table right? Which does actually put GMAT focus at a bit of a disadvantage. That's why I'm trying to get the word out on this, as much as possible. Is like that concordance table is not end all be all. So my guess is that they're using that, and that there used to be a concordance table on the GRE. There no longer is. My guess is that they're just going up based off of the school's averages. Yeah, so like HBS or any of the M7 schools, maybe with Stanford as an exception, generally is about 162, 163 on both the verbal and the quant section as an average for those tests. I will tell you that is easier to achieve for most test takers than their GMAT averages, FYI. Yeah, so I do think that there is an advantage there on the GRE, and there is a little bit of an advantage based on percentiles in the rankings of GRE score, FYI. So employers, my guess, are probably taking the school's lead on this and just sort of taking their averages and doing it. That may not be the best way, but it's kind of just the only way to be able to do it without really diving into every single score and seeing how it would compare to other tests, which there's no way they're going to take that amount of time to do it. So again, interviewees might need to do a little bit of educating, or even just as you're doing coffee chats or things like this, of saying, yeah, I have this 695 score, 685 score, something like this. But if you look at the quant and verbal individually, it actually would have been a 750, on the previous exam. Just kind of mentioning this in coffee chats and stuff, so that they can understand that the concordance is not perfect. Yeah.
Would you like
Who
to
do you think should have the onus of educating? Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just following up on that, who do you think should have the onus of educating? Shouldn't it be on the test makers, or should it be on the business schools who are the actual users?
The test makers definitely feel like they're educating the schools, right? And they're like, oh yeah, we do all this training, they understand all of this, and I guarantee you the schools do not. In my conversations with them in our conference that we just attended, they do not get this nuance. Yeah, they literally just go down the table and they compare the scores, and that is it. Yeah, and so, yep, the test makers believe that they are educating the schools on this, but I don't feel like it is. There's more nuance to it than the schools realize. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe with AIGAC, we could do a follow-up session online this fall with schools and GMAC, and then again with ETS to really hammer that.
That'd be interesting.
I think
that'd be interesting
for anyone applying for an MBA now and ahead. But that said, I wanted to ask Travis, how do these tests differ in terms of test taking flexibility, like frequency? We spoke about there's usually, a 16-day delay with the GMAT. You mentioned total number of times lifetime. So again, test taking flexibility, frequency, test availability, and policies across these three exams.
A great question, because my client who took the GMAT 5 times actually ended up submitting a GRE score that was better. So, both GMAT and GRE are 5 times in a calendar year, 5 times in 12 months, and I do not believe that they're flexible on those policies for either one. So 5 times in 12 months on either exam. You've got to have 16 days between GMAT tests, and that's regardless of whether you take it online or you take it in the test center. Yeah, so you still have to have that 16-day window. GRE is a 21-day window. Yeah, so you have to have 3 weeks between exams. And as we're starting to get coming up on round 1 deadlines, this is something that I'm reminding my clients of, is you've got to have 21 days, between GRE. And so you need to plan that out appropriately. I always do recommend, though, don't just try to slide in a test if you're not ready to take it, right? So it's not going to do anyone any good, to go into that test and spend $300 on it, and it's not going to be the score that you wanted, that you want. I always recommend at least 1 to 2 practice exams in your target score range before you take that official exam. In terms of flexibility, I will give you another kind of dirty little secret in scheduling your test. So, as everyone here, I'm sure, is well aware, many of us, schedule a test date, we work toward that test date, and we find that we're not ready yet, right? And so we reschedule that test date and, to a time further out to give ourselves a little bit more time to study, as you should. It's a great strategy. But what that means is that test dates open up close to the date. So if you're like, oh man, I just scored this incredible score on the GMAT, I want to go in and take it right away. About 3 to 6 days out, you will see, time open up in these like prime times. So you don't have to take it at like 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday or something, right? That you'll see Saturday at 10 a.m. open up. Yeah. You'll see, these prime spots open up 3 to 6 days out, 3 to 8 days out, something like that. And so, check the website and just, check the various locations that are, convenient to you, and check a couple of times a day. You will see stuff open up. Yeah.
For sure. Thanks, Travis. There's actually a couple of questions that came in from the audience I wanted to mention, but really quick, I wanted to say that with respect to the GMAT, you were talking about that 16-day strict waiting period, but there's a little loophole. I don't believe I heard you mention it. That loophole, if you've taken the in-person, like on-site versus online at home, I think you are allowed to take it the next day. If you switch to different.
The loophole has been filled, yes, and you're no longer allowed to do that. Yeah, just in the last couple of months. Yeah, wow. So okay. No more loophole.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's jump to a question from Srinath, who asks, why should employers care about scores? It's a very good question, Srinath. Travis, why don't you start us off, and anyone can comment after that.
Yeah. I mean, you guys probably have even better insights than I do. Very few employers do, by the way. Yeah, it's typically top management consulting firms and some investment banks. And it's just sort of a shortcut for them in that it's a very demanding job, right? And they need someone who's going to be able to just walk in on day one and be able to hit the ground running. And so it's a bit of a shortcut for them to be able to see, are you going to be able to hit the ground running on day one? So it's typically only these employers.
Get so many applications. You're talking like MBBs, like top consulting investment banking. They get so many applications for these high-paying prestigious jobs at these prestigious companies. So naturally, they would appreciate another filter to.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Sorry, it seems like the theme that we're constantly seeing is how can I filter somebody out for this versus that, and how can I keep filtering for especially like these high performance things. So it just seems to be like funnel over funnel, especially when it comes to that.
Yep. No, absolutely right. But I don't. It actually is not a bad filter though. Yeah, I mean, so MBBs and top investment banks and stuff, like the skill sets that are required to succeed on the GMAT are nearly identical to the skill sets required for their jobs. These ability to think on your feet very quickly, the ability to be very comfortable with numbers, the ability to kind of know when something's off a little bit. Be like, wait a minute, that just doesn't feel quite right. Like this level of fluency with numbers and with data and all of that, but also be able to communicate well, right? That your communication skills are strong. It's a good fit. So it is sort of a funnel in a funnel. I mean, you've already gotten into one of these top schools, and now they're funneling amongst people of that. But to me, it's not random. It isn't like it's a bad funnel. It's pretty decent for what skills they're looking for.
And so this begs the question: what does one do if they've come in on a test waiver and they end up going to interviews at these MBBs or top investment banking firms? Right? Having to take the GMAT after you've gone through an MBA sounds like hell. So that's your path, man. Figure that out early and
true.
right?
But I have heard like stories where people were asked to take tests if they had to
Yep.
like get into a certain path by their career development centers as soon as they come in, especially with, as Travis said, the finance, consulting, and some of these top
Mm.
roles.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
This is another question, either Bara or Travis. I'm thinking this is another person named Travis Frazier. This time, can you discuss the EA a bit? Tips for preparing new insights, etc. Take it away.
Yeah. So I think the best way to study for the EA is to study for the GMAT, quite frankly. Yeah. So there are materials that are specific, like official materials from GMAT that are specific to the EA, and they tend to have fewer problems and they're more expensive. But the materials for the GMAT are identical. There are actually some of the problems are exactly the same. Like in the GMAT and the EA, I have not seen any difference in vibe, in flavor, in anything between the GMAT materials and the EA exam. And so the key thing though is that you really do have to make sure that your integrated reasoning skills are very strong, because this matters a lot. It's the very first section that you take. Under the old, legacy GMAT, it was sort of our throwaway section. It was like, oh, who cares about integrated reasoning? It becomes the most important section on the IR. So that's a little shift, and there's not as many materials out there for it. But data insights materials from GMAT are great. They're great. It's the same question types, and it will train you on IR. I would say the other thing too on EA that's important is timing. So within each subsection, so IR has 12 questions and each of the other sections have 14. So if you split that in half, the first 6 in IR and the first 7 in the other sections are important because they inform the second half of the exam. The second half of each section adapts based on it. But you need to make sure that you're completing the entire section. So you can't just suck up all the time in the first half of the section. You've got to be willing to kick out questions that are too hard. And Eric, as you mentioned earlier, within each subsection it does not adapt, and you can kind of do it in any order you want. And so if you hit this just absurdly difficult question, just hit any answer choice at all and move on. And then if you have time within the subsection to go back and see if you can get a better guess in there, then you can do it. But do not let these very, very difficult questions suck a ton of time on the EA. Will kill you. Yeah. The one thing to keep in mind that is, I think, unfortunate, and who knows, maybe sometime down the line they will change this, but the EA still has sentence correction in verbal. Whereas the GMAT no longer does. So the GMAT study materials no longer have it. And the GRE has never had sentence correction. And so you've got to find good sentence correction materials to study from for the EA, because it's still in the exam, for better or for worse.
Sounds like the EA is waiting for the makeover.
I think so. Yeah, they've said they have no plans to change it. We've asked. Yeah, GMAT. So it isn't going to change in the near future. But sentence correction, I think, is so antiquated. Like, it does not test any skills that would matter to your management abilities. So, I say get rid of it.
It's true, though. That's the only book. That's the book that we actually authored, was a GMAT sentence correction intensive, which has become obsolete. But it is a really good book to use to prepare for this, or if you just want to have better grammar skills.
That's right.
That could be good. The other thing I want to say is, even just pulling back a little bit for Travis Fraser, who asked this question, is that you want to figure out what you need to improve. You don't need to do a soup to nuts process. You want to take a diagnostic and see exactly what you're doing. And you want to understand why you're getting questions wrong, not just what you're getting wrong. So if you're having an issue with an algebraic equation, what is the issue you're having? Is there a logic to the wrong answer that you picked, so that you understand what's not working, and then reverse engineer why is the right answer the correct answer? So you really want to engage with it. You don't need to do a full thing, which is, what the big box companies will have you do. You actually want to think about this process as a business problem. How are you going to effectively, efficiently get your score up. And you want to use the diagnostic test as a fertile ground to learn about yourself and who you are when you take the test. Even your reading speed. I mean, that's why we have a reading. That's why we like figure out how fast people are reading, because if time is the issue, then that's a really great way to move quickly through the content. And then you have more time to do some of the questions that typically take you longer to do, right? So this is all about engineering for yourself and knowing yourself better to see what you need to do to improve.
Yep. And as we're winding down today, I want to thank you guys for all these brilliant answers and insights. Great conversation. Before we go, Travis, let's leave our audience with some of your top tips for doing well on D-Day, on the test day. For what do you want to leave us with?
I would say my number one tip actually is very counterintuitive, and that is do not do any studying the day before. None. Yeah. Go do something that you enjoy. Go get your mind off of the exam. I'm a big cyclist. I would go on a ride, not like the longest ride of my life. Like, you also don't want to exhaust yourself, but do things that you enjoy. I gave this bit of advice for one client who's very skeptical of it, and he said, Travis, I just binge watched Netflix all day long. He scored the best score he's ever scored, even better than his practice exams. It is helpful. The number one thing you can do to come in for test day is to be sharp. Yeah, like, it is not a test that you can just cram for. And so even if you've been very successful in cramming, every day up until the moment you take the test in previous exams, I have never, not even one person have I seen that work for these standardized tests. Yeah, so that's my number one tip. Mm-hmm.
Nice. All right.
Travis,
well,
thanks so much for all the generosity of your dirty little secrets, but I'm sure so much better for our clients. And I really love how you wrap it up with saying that this is not something that you cram for. What business schools look for is adaptability and also this ability to think on your feet. So with that's all the time we have for today, folks. I want to thank Travis and Bara and others for your great insights and also the wonderful questions from the guests in the audience. If you liked today's episode, please give us a little thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe to MBA Waves to stay on top of all the latest trends and news in the world of MBAs, business and education. We'll see you here next week, same time and place. And please do head over to mbawaves.com for more content. Bye now.
Bye-bye.